Will he be able to use Rob Reiner's fortune to defend himself with this very fancy lawyer against charges that he killed his own dad? Did Rob and Michelle keep him in their will?
Breaking. One courtroom, one son, two parents gone. An illegal battle so twisted it's tearing Hollywood apart. Nick Reiner's trial isn't just about guilt, it's about whether a broken mind can erase criminal responsibility or whether one calm stop at a gas station just sealed his fate forever. Because when this case explodes in court, everything changes. All eyes are locked on a single Los Angeles courtroom where the name Reiner now carries a weight no legacy could survive. Nick Reiner, son of legendary filmmaker Rob Reiner, stands accused of the unthinkable, the violent loss of both his parents inside their own home. From the outside, the case already feels locked, sealed, and headed toward life behind bars. But then Alan Jackson enters the frame, and suddenly, nothing feels certain anymore. Jackson, known in legal circles as a courtroom assassin with a taste for impossible cases, isn't here to argue innocence. He's here to dismantle intent, to tear apart the idea that this was a clear-minded, calculated act. The defense doesn't deny the horror. It reframes it. Mental illness isn't just a footnote here, it's the core battlefield. Schizophrenia, medication changes, a mind allegedly unraveling for years. But the prosecution is waiting, sharpened, relentless, armed with one haunting detail that refuses to go away. After the tragedy, Nick didn't collapse. He didn't scream. He didn't spiral. He left. He drove. He stopped for gas. He paid. Calm. Controlled. And that single sequence cracks open a terrifying question that hangs over the entire trial. If Nick Reiner was truly disconnected from reality, how did he manage reality so well afterward? That question alone creates a suspense loop the jury won't escape. Because this isn't just about what happened inside that bedroom, it's about whether awareness returned the moment the door closed behind him. And once that doubt exists, the case transforms from tragedy into a legal minefield where every move could mean life, or a narrow escape from it. The moment the defense anchors itself to mental illness, the entire courtroom atmosphere shifts. Because insanity isn't just a legal claim in California, it's a battlefield where almost everyone loses. The standard is brutal, unforgiving, and designed to fail. It's not enough for Alan Jackson to prove that Nick Reiner was struggling, unstable, or even deeply unwell. The law demands something far more extreme. He must prove that Nick didn't understand what he was doing and didn't understand that it was wrong. Miss either one, and the whole defense collapses. That's why this strategy feels less like a plea and more like a high-wire act over a legal abyss. The defense isn't selling a sudden breakdown. They're telling a long, slow-burn story of a mind deteriorating in plain sight, while everyone around him desperately tried to hold it together. Years of psychiatric treatment, multiple hospitalizations, diagnoses that followed him like shadows. Antipsychotic medications constantly adjusted because nothing seemed to stick. Periods of clarity followed by terrifying relapses. The defense wants the jury to see that what happened that night wasn't an isolated explosion, it was the final rupture of a system that had been cracking for years. But hey, race where the tension tightens. The prosecution doesn't deny the diagnosis. They don't deny the schizophrenia. In fact, they lean into it calmly, strategically, because a medical label doesn't equal legal insanity. Plenty of people live with schizophrenia and never harm anyone. That's the unspoken reality hanging in the room. So the state doesn't attack the illness. They attack the behavior. They rewind the clock to the hours after the tragedy and place the jury right there, frame by frame. Nick leaves the house. He gets into his car. He drives through Los Angeles traffic. He stops at a gas station. Surveillance cameras capture a man believed to be Nick calmly walking inside, selecting items, paying at the counter. No visible panic. No confusion. No meltdown. No obvious break from reality. That footage becomes the prosecution's quiet sledgehammer. Because in the eyes of the law, that calm doesn't look like psychosis, it looks like control. And control is poison to an insanity defense. This is where the story gets unsettling, because calm behavior after extreme violence messes with everyone's expectations. We want chaos to match the crime. We expect unraveling. But history doesn't always cooperate. Courts have seen it before: individuals who commit shocking acts and then move through the aftermath with eerie composure. The defense argues that emotional flatness can be a symptom of psychosis, that dissociation can look like calm, that a shattered mind doesn't always scream. Sometimes it goes quiet. Sometimes it goes cold. But the prosecution counters with a devastatingly simple point. The law doesn't judge inner turmoil, it judges choices. Driving requires judgment. Buying items requires decision-making. Renting a hotel room requires planning, a credit card, identification, and awareness of consequences. Each step Nick allegedly took after leaving that house adds another brick to the wall closing in around him. And then comes the detail that makes jurors lean forward in their seats: the hotel room in Santa Monica. Why would someone who lived at home suddenly need a hotel just hours after such a night? The defense frames it as confusion, flight, a man trying to escape an internal storm he couldn't understand. The prosecution frames it as consciousness of guilt, not hiding in an alley, not wandering aimlessly, but checking into a hotel like someone trying to put distance between themselves and a crime scene. That single decision may sound small, but in a courtroom, it's massive. It suggests foresight. And foresight is deadly when you're arguing a total loss of mental control. Still, Alan Jackson isn't new to this kind of pressure. He knows the jury won't be swayed by sympathy alone. So the defense prepares to take them inside psychosis itself, not with buzzwords, but with lived experience. Forensic psychiatrists will testify that during severe psychotic episodes, a person can appear outwardly functional while internally disconnected from reality. Hallucinations don't announce themselves. Delusions don't wear warning labels. Fear can feel rational when your brain is lying to you. A person may believe they're acting in self-preservation, even if the threat doesn't exist. That's the terrifying paradox the defense leans on. A distorted sense of reality can coexist with basic motor function. You can drive while your mind is broken. You can pay for gas while your moral compass is shattered. The defense will argue that Nick's calm wasn't clarity, it was emptiness. But the prosecution isn't finished. They introduce another chilling angle: cleanup. Reports suggest signs of blood wiped away, items rearranged. Organization, awareness, an attempt to manage a scene. If proven, that alone could devastate any insanity claim. Because cleanup isn't instinct, it's intention. And intention is the line the law refuses to blur. Then there's the night before. Conan O'Brien's house party. Witnesses describe Nick as strange, tense, asking odd questions, getting into heated exchanges. The defense calls it evidence of mental instability. The prosecution shrugs. Odd isn't insane. Heated arguments aren't psychosis. Recognizing people, understanding social dynamics, engaging in conflict, all signs of awareness. And awareness is everything in this case. The jury will be asked to live inside that contradiction. A man with documented schizophrenia who still seemed capable of navigating the world. A person allegedly lost in delusion who still followed routines. That's the gray zone where this trial lives. The defense wants that gray to swallow certainty. The prosecution wants it to disappear under logic. Because legally, being sick isn't enough. You can be unstable. You can be erratic. You can even be deeply unwell. But if you know what you're doing and you know it's wrong, insanity is off the table. That's the cold reality of California law. And that's why this paragraph of the story isn't just about diagnosis, it's about perception. How the jury interprets calm. How they interpret movement. How they interpret silence. By the time this phase of the trial unfolds, one thing will be painfully clear. The insanity defense isn't about proving Nick Reiner is different from everyone else. It's about proving his mind crossed a line so severe that the law itself has to step back. And that's a line juries almost never acknowledge. Which raises the next question: if insanity won't save him, what's the next move? Because in a case this heavy, the defense can't afford to rely on a single thread. And that's exactly where the strategy pivots next. Once the insanity defense starts wobbling under the weight of surveillance footage, timelines, and post-incident behavior, the defense doesn't abandon the fight, it mutates. This is where Alan Jackson shifts from emotional storytelling to surgical lawyering. Because when total mental collapse can't be proven cleanly, the next battlefield becomes altered mental state. Not insanity, not innocence. Something murkier, quieter, but potentially just as powerful. Involuntary intoxication. On paper, it sounds technical. In reality, it's explosive, because unlike insanity, this defense doesn't require proving that Nick Reiner lost all understanding of right and wrong. It only requires proving that his judgment was hijacked by something he didn't knowingly choose. And under California law, that distinction can change everything. If the defense can show that Nick's mental state was involuntarily altered by medication interactions, unknown substances, or an unexpected chemical reaction, the legal consequences can mirror insanity itself. Full acquittal, or at the very least, a dramatic reduction that pulls him back from the edge of life without parole. This is where every detail from the night before becomes radioactive. Conan O'Brien's house party is no longer background color, it's ground zero. Who poured the drinks? What was in them? Who interacted with Nick, and for how long? Did anyone notice changes in his behavior after he consumed alcohol? Did anyone see him suddenly become disoriented, paranoid, agitated, or emotionally flat? These questions aren't gossip, they're potential legal lifelines. Because involuntary intoxication doesn't mean someone was drugged in a movie-style setup. It can mean something far more subtle. Prescription medications mixed with alcohol in unpredictable ways. A dosage change that destabilized brain chemistry. A reaction that no doctor warned about. In a person already diagnosed with schizophrenia, those interactions can be catastrophic. The defense doesn't have to prove malice from another person, only that Nick didn't consent to the mental state he entered. But this path is razor thin. The moment the prosecution proves that Nick knowingly consumed alcohol or substances, the defense starts bleeding credibility. Voluntary intoxication doesn't carry the same legal shield. California courts are blunt about it. If you choose to ingest something and things spiral, that's on you. So Jackson's team has to thread a needle. They'll argue that Nick may have consumed something ordinary, something socially acceptable, without knowing it would trigger a mental collapse. A drink that should have been harmless. A medication that had been prescribed for years, but suddenly interacted in a way no one could predict. This isn't about recklessness, it's about stolen judgment. And if the jury buys that, the entire narrative shifts again. Still, even that defense has limits. Toxicology reports become critical. Blood tests, medication logs, pharmacy records, witness testimony. The prosecution will hammer every inconsistency. If no foreign substances are found, if timelines don't match, if witnesses don't corroborate sudden impairment, the involuntary intoxication argument collapses just as fast as the insanity plea did. And Alan Jackson knows it. That's why he never puts all his chips on one square. This case isn't about a single magic defense, it's about creating enough uncertainty that first-degree murder no longer feels inevitable. That's where the strategy pivots again, this time toward charge reduction. It's not flashy. It doesn't promise freedom. But it's often where real outcomes are decided. Instead of fighting over whether Nick Reiner is criminally responsible at all, the defense reframes the question. Did he premeditate? Because under California law, that's the line that separates life without parole from the possibility of parole. Premeditation isn't about days or weeks, it can exist in minutes. But it requires clarity, deliberation, a formed intent. And the defense's entire mission now becomes tearing that concept apart piece by piece. They'll argue this wasn't a plan, it was a collapse. No drawn-out scheme, no cold calculation, no timeline that shows Nick thinking through consequences. Instead, they paint a moment of impulsive chaos. A mind already destabilized by mental illness, potentially altered by substances, colliding with emotional tension and unresolved family conflict. In that version of events, the act wasn't chosen, it erupted. And that distinction matters. Because if the jury believes Nick didn't form a deliberate intent to kill, first-degree murder starts to feel legally inappropriate. The prosecution, of course, tells a different story. They build stepping stones. A heated argument earlier in the evening. Time passing. Opportunity. A return to the parents' bedroom with a weapon. In California, even a brief pause between conflict and violence can imply premeditation. The state will argue that Nick had time to cool down and didn't. That's why every minute on the timeline becomes a weapon. Did he retrieve the knife deliberately? Did he enter the room intentionally? Did he have a chance to stop? Each answer tightens the noose. The defense counters with fragmentation. Psychosis doesn't follow clocks. Emotional breakdowns don't respect cooling off periods. A mind in crisis doesn't move in straight lines. Jackson will argue that what looks like a pause from the outside may have been mental freefall on the inside. That Nick wasn't calculating, he was unraveling. And if the jury accepts that, the charge could drop to second-degree murder. That shift is massive. It transforms a sentence from guaranteed life without parole to 15 years to life, with a chance however small at parole. Not redemption, not freedom, but a future that isn't automatically erased. There's also another card hovering on the table: acute psychotic episode. This isn't full insanity. It doesn't excuse the act. It explains it. The defense may argue that Nick experienced a sudden break from reality that night, a flare-up of schizophrenia so severe it shattered his perception in the moment. In this version, he knew he was acting, but not why. He wasn't executing a plan, he was reacting to internal threats no one else could see. That explanation doesn't clear him, but it muddies intent enough to matter. And then there's the argument from provocation. The heated exchange with his father earlier that night becomes emotionally significant. The defense might frame it as a trigger, not justification, but context. A spark in a mind already soaked in gasoline. But again, California law is unforgiving. Provocation doesn't erase responsibility. It only softens it if the reaction was immediate and uncontrollable. The prosecution will argue the argument ended. Time passed. The act wasn't spontaneous, it was chosen. And that battle will come down to credibility, psychology, and how the jury interprets silence between moments. By the end of this phase of the trial, one truth becomes unavoidable. This case isn't about a single defense winning. It's about stacking doubts, about making premeditation feel uncertain, about turning certainty into discomfort. Because once the jury hesitates to call it planned, the legal outcome changes dramatically. And that's the pressure point Alan Jackson is aiming for. Because when freedom is off the table, survival becomes the goal. And in this courtroom, survival means avoiding one word at all costs: premeditation. As the defense exhausts its most aggressive legal maneuvers, the battlefield narrows, and what remains is the most uncomfortable territory of all: the human one. This is where the case stops being about clever theories and starts being about consequences. Because if insanity doesn't clear Nick Reiner, if involuntary intoxication can't be proven cleanly, and if premeditation still hangs in the air like a shadow that won't move, the trial enters its final, most realistic phase: mitigation, mercy, and damage control. This is the point where Alan Jackson stops trying to flip the board and instead tries to keep his client alive within the system. And in California, that difference is everything. Because the moment the words "first-degree murder with special circumstances" stick, every door slams shut. Life without parole. No discretion. No second chances. No future. That's the nightmare scenario the defense is fighting tooth and nail to avoid. This is where Nick's entire life gets laid bare in court, not as an excuse, but as an explanation. The defense begins weaving together a devastating narrative of long-term mental illness colliding with substance dependency, not as separate issues, but as a feedback loop that slowly destroyed stability. Psychiatrists explain how schizophrenia doesn't stay static. It evolves. It flares. It retreats. Medications stop working. Dosages change. Side effects stack up. And when substances enter the picture, even casually, the results can be catastrophic. This isn't a sudden snap, it's erosion. Year after year. Relapse after relapse. Warning signs everywhere. The defense will show records from treatment centers, hospitals, therapists, and rehab facilities, building a paper trail that stretches back long before that night. The goal isn't sympathy, it's credibility. To prove that this breakdown didn't come out of nowhere. And then the story turns even darker. Because Nick's parents weren't absent. They weren't negligent. They didn't give up on him. Quite the opposite. Rob Reiner and his wife spent years trying to save their son. They paid for treatment. They arranged care. They stood by him through setbacks that would have broken most families. They even helped create a film inspired by Nick's struggles, a project meant to raise awareness about addiction and mental illness, meant to warn others about exactly what happens when these conditions spiral out of control. In court, that detail lands like a punch to the chest. What was meant as a message of hope now feels like a tragic premonition. The defense doesn't frame this as irony, they frame it as inevitability. A family doing everything right and still losing. This is where the jury is forced into emotional whiplash. On one hand, they're being asked to confront a brutal crime scene. On the other, they're being shown a man whose entire adult life was defined by instability, treatment, and decline. The prosecution, meanwhile, refuses to let the narrative soften. They bring it back to action, to facts, to the scene, multiple wounds, the intensity, the location, a quiet bedroom in the middle of the night. They argue that mental illness doesn't explain the extent of the violence, that compassion doesn't erase responsibility, and they'll remind the jury again and again that plenty of people live with schizophrenia without committing acts like this. The implication is sharp, but controlled illness may explain behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. Then comes one of the most dangerous moments for the defense, the possibility of Nick testifying. In cases like this, silence can feel like guilt, but speaking is a minefield. Every word would be dissected, every pause analyzed, every inconsistency magnified. If Nick appears too composed, it hurts the defense. If he appears erratic, the prosecution will argue manipulation. There is no safe version of the stand. And yet, without his voice, the defense risks leaving gaps the prosecution will happily fill. It's a brutal calculation. One wrong answer could undo months of preparation in seconds. Alan Jackson knows this. That's why mitigation often becomes the quieter, safer play. Let experts speak. Let records speak. Let history speak. Behind the scenes, this is also where negotiations happen. Because despite the drama of trials, more than 95% of criminal cases in California end in plea deals. If the defense can convince the district attorney that life without parole feels excessive given the mental health evidence, there's room to maneuver. Charges can be reduced. Special circumstances can be dropped. Sentencing recommendations can soften. The name of the game becomes avoiding the harshest outcome, not winning outright. And in this case, that could mean the difference between dying in prison and one day seeing daylight again. But even mitigation isn't guaranteed. The prosecution may decide this case is too high profile, too symbolic, too devastating to compromise. They may push for the maximum, believing the evidence justifies it. And if that happens, the defense's last stand becomes technical, procedural, relentless. Alan Jackson is known for this phase tearing into evidence collection, chain of custody, search warrants, interrogations. If even one piece of evidence was mishandled, collected improperly, or introduced without proper foundation, it can be challenged, suppressed, neutralized. In law, technicalities aren't tricks, they're safeguards. And Jackson has built his reputation on exploiting them when lives are on the line. The defense may file motions to suppress surveillance footage, challenge digital timelines, question forensic conclusions, or scrutinize police conduct. Even respected departments make mistakes under pressure. And in Los Angeles, high-profile cases often move fast. Too fast. If any corner was cut, any protocol skipped, that crack could widen into reasonable doubt. The jury doesn't need to believe Nick is innocent. They only need to believe the case isn't airtight. And once doubt exists, everything changes. Still, there's a brutal truth hovering over the entire courtroom. If the jury believes this was first-degree murder, none of the backstory matters. Not the illness, not the addiction, not the family's efforts. The law becomes mechanical, automatic. Mercy disappears. That's why every strategy, insanity, intoxication, provocation, lack of premeditation, mitigation circles the same core question. Intent, purpose, control. Was Nick Reiner acting with a clear mind, or was he swallowed by one he could no longer command? By the time closing arguments arrive, the jury won't just be weighing evidence. They'll be weighing philosophy. How much responsibility does a person carry when their mind betrays them? Where does compassion end and accountability begin? Is justice about punishment alone, or about understanding the full human collapse behind the act? There are no clean answers, no satisfying outcomes, only choices with irreversible consequences. And that's why this case has gripped Los Angeles so tightly. It isn't just a murder trial. It's a referendum on mental illness, family, responsibility, and the limits of the law. Whatever the verdict, it won't feel like a victory. It will feel like a line drawn through a tragedy that never should have happened, a reminder that sometimes the justice system isn't choosing between right and wrong, but between two versions of loss. As January 7th approaches, Los Angeles holds its breath. This trial isn't just about what Nick Reiner did, it's about who he was when he did it. a calculated actor, or a man lost inside his own mind. The courtroom will hear science, law, grief, and legacy collide in real time. Some will see justice demanding punishment. Others will see illness demanding mercy. And the jury will be forced to choose between two truths that can't fully coexist. That's what makes this case so haunting. There are no clean endings here, only consequences. So let me ask you this. If you were sitting on that jury, would the gas station footage outweigh the medical records? Would calm behavior erase years of documented psychosis? Or does this feel like a mental collapse that spiraled beyond control? Drop your take in the comments, because this is one of those cases where every perspective hits different. If this deep dive made you think, hit like, share it, and subscribe for more Hollywood courtroom breakdowns that go deeper than the headlines. This story isn't over, and neither is the conversation.